My name is Kristen Haggerty. I'm with the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, IREC, and this webinar is being hosted as part of a Department of Energy funded project. The acronym is called Empowered, but the goal of the project is to create education and resources for building safety officials to do with distributed energy resources, and that's a pretty broad category that definitely includes energy storage systems. So again, this is part of a Department of Energy funded project. We have 2 websites with free information on them, and I'll tell you more at the end, but one of them is the Clean Energy Clearinghouse, where you can find a number of really concise resources to do with energy storage systems, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, even what distributed energy resources means, as well as solar and storage. We also have a learning management system, cleanenergytraining.org, where we have primarily we have solar PV safety for firefighters, but we also have kind of quite a few trainings for AHJs to do right now with solar and storage, and we'll be adding to those. We'll be going for about an hour, and then we're going to open it up to question and answer. You can type in your question in the Q&A, or you can use the raise hand function if you want to, hear your question and have everyone else here on camera. So with that being said, I just wanted to make sure it's fairly clear what we're going to cover today. We definitely know that this is a huge topic. We have people from all over the country right now who have registered for this. I'm going to actually while we're doing that, Michelle, can you help me launch a poll, or can I launch it? I think I can do it here. So let me just launch a poll while people are getting started. There's 2 questions. We want to know who's on the call today. So I put kind of a number of job roles that you might hold. And then we wanted to know also kind of how familiar are you, or how common are energy storage systems in your particular area? And that'll help the presenters to, certainly tailor what they're doing. But that being said, this is primarily going to cover residential energy storage systems. And we're not going to go terribly into the technologies themselves and the basics, but we definitely can address at the end of this, and kind of after, we'll follow up with other resources that you can use to get those more specific resources that will help you with technology basics and things like that. Because our goal is really to make sure that we can provide a range of resources that you can access no matter where you are. If you're an experienced AHJ, or if you are a first responder, whatever, we want to help direct you to different resources for the different technologies to help you do your job more confidently and feel more comfortable with the technologies as they're emerging. So I'm going to give people a couple more minutes on the polls, and then I will end it and share it. But we've had a good number of people. I'm going to give you just another minute. Matt and Brad, let me give you a couple minutes while people are doing the polls to introduce yourselves, and that'll give people a chance to do that. So Matt, could I ask you to just give a quick bio, and then Brad, you too, and then I'll close the poll.
Sure. Thanks, Kristen. So for everybody on the call, my name is Matt Paiss. I'm a technical advisor at Pacific Northwest National Labs. We're one of the 17 DOE-funded national labs. And my role at the labs, I lead their energy storage system safety efforts. What that looks like is direct involvement representing the lab on a number of codes and standards panels, a lot of education and outreach, trying to explain what we are saying in those codes and standards, and then also helping projects from utilities to manufacturers to AHJs out with deploying energy storage in a safe and rapid way. So I just also want to say that if you're hearing a lot of chickens in the background, those are my support staff. I'm working from home like all of us are, and so apologize for the background noise if they get busy laying eggs. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Brad Fox. I'm the Assistant Fire Marshal for Santa Clara County Fire Department. We are an independent fire district, and we also contract with cities and towns in our county. We serve 7 different cities and towns, a lot for both emergency response and fire prevention services. And then we also contract with the county to provide fire prevention services in unincorporated areas. So I am definitely not an expert in battery storage systems, and I will happily defer any technical questions about the systems themselves to Matt. My experience with ESS really comes out of necessity and having to review and permit these systems. I think, like many others, when I initially got in the fire service, I never thought I would have to know anything about batteries. And we think we have to know about suppression systems, detection systems, and some life safety associated with the building code. And it seems every few years we have to learn new technologies in this field. So before it was ERCs, emergency responder, radio communication systems, and mobile fueling, and now the hot topic of the past couple of years has been ESS. So the jurisdictions I serve are either very affluent, and we see a lot of residential PV going in along with ESS, or in unincorporated areas of Santa Clara County, in the mountains, they're subject to a lot of PG&E, public safety power shutoffs. So they're installing a lot of ESS for backup for their homes. So most of my experience it comes from residential systems. We have seen few commercial systems, but vast majority is residential. So, thank you.
Well, thanks. And I have to apologize. Phil Oakes from NASFM was going to join us on this call, and he couldn't. So I'm going to be playing his role today. This webinar will be recorded, and we will certainly distribute the link, and it will be available on the websites that I showed you as well. So you should be seeing the results of the polls. So of our, about 160 folks on the call today, we've got a lot of fire code AHJs and fire marshals, and thank you. I know several of you serve more than one role for sure. We're joined by our building inspectors and electrical inspectors, as well as our plans examiners. We've got a good number of engineers, as well as some installers and first responders. So thank you to all of you, especially for kind of responding about how common things are. And we've got a pretty good distribution, but certainly to Brad's point, it's becoming more common all the time. So let me pass it over to Matt, and I will pull up your slides whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Brad, thanks for joining too. I neglected to add that I did have a life prior to the lab. I was a firefighter in San Jose for about 23 years. So I have some background on the concerns from the fire service and what AHJs are facing. So I have a couple of slides just to kind of kick off the start of our discussion. So Kristen, if you want to put that first one up, what I'm going to start out with a little bit is at a high level, kind of a battery 101. There's a number of different storage technologies that are being deployed. The top bullet, lithium ion, that is by far the number one technology. But there's also flow batteries, and there's some other technologies that are gaining market share at different rates, but lithium ion is primarily the one. What really drives the deployment, it really comes down to both energy density and cost. So the more energy you can put in a smaller space is really critical in a car, not so critical in stationary storage, but cost really is a big driver, as well as safety. Next slide, please. So this is really critical to understand. When we talk about safety of energy storage systems, it is not based on solely chemistry. It's not based solely on a manufacturer. It involves all of these bullet points, and they all play a role. And so we've heard a lot over the last couple of years about lithium iron phosphate. And, sometimes the marketing is not as accurate as we'd like to see. You'll see some brochures out there that say that they are not prone to thermal runaway. That's not true. They have a higher temperature at which they'll go into thermal runaway, which is great. They don't use cobalt, which has some human effects on how it's mined, and that's really critical. But from a hazard perspective, there are still some risks with any of the lithium ion chemistries. So we really want to encourage, safety at a system level. And so that involves the quality control, the cell manufacturing. You can have a top tier cell that has a manufacturing defect that could result in a thermal runaway event. How the battery system is put together, the battery management system, and that is really the key device that manages the charging and discharging of the batteries. And if there's any overcharging or undercharging, it's the BMS that will turn it off. The communications among all these subsystems, the environmental controls where required. Any fire protection system really needs to be tailored and designed for that hazard. And then the last item really is one of the key ones. It's workmanship. You can have quality components, but an error in the workmanship could lead to a fire. So it really truly is a systems approach. Okay, next slide, please. So these are the ways that they can fail. It can be a thermal abuse exposed to high heat. Electrical abuse is the primary one. Overcharging, rapid discharging if it's discharged too low. Mechanical abuse, more an issue during the assembly or manufacturing process. Internal defects has possibly been one of the leading causes of system failures. Next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about the concerns from responders. And these are in order of what they're actually experiencing. The micromobility devices, the scooters, the electric bicycles, mini skateboards, these are resulting in the greatest number of individual responses today. And a picture in the upper right is a recent incident in New York. The FDNY is reporting about 10 incidents a month, primarily micromobility devices. So one of the questions is, are these devices meeting the requirements of the UL listing for micromobility devices? If they are, then we need to look at where there's a gap in those standards and try and address it. But internationally, that standard, and I know Megan, you're on the call, you'll correct me, drop in the chat the actual UL number, 2720, is really an important standard, but it's not necessarily adopted internationally. And so we would like to see that. EV fires and structures, there have been several. And so this is a concern. The picture in the bottom there is an incident that occurred in Montreal where there was a fire in EV, actually resulted in an explosion. And so that garage door does not belong across the street. Thankfully, nobody was in front of it, but it is an area of concern that we really want to address. And then lastly is the stationary storage. Thankfully, there are not a lot of responses that responders are having to go to. However, we're still fairly early. And so we do want to get ahead of the curve in terms of training and recommended best practices. Okay, so I just want to put that out, that the reality is this is where the fires are occurring. It's primarily in the smaller devices first. Okay, next slide, please. Now, in the residential space, which is the majority of the people on this call, there have been a couple of incidents and some recalls. These, luckily, the manufacturers are trying to respond to these very quickly to identify gaps in either the design or in the codes and standards. So some of the earlier installations were not required to have gone through large-scale fire testing. And now that is a requirement based on the second edition of 9540. It does require the fire testing to 9540A for residential batteries that are installed indoors or on walls. The bottom picture is actually from Germany. And since that incident, there's actually been several more in Europe, and even an explosion in a residential battery. So that is a great concern. The explosion risk is probably the greatest concern. Fires, while they can cause a lot of damage to the building, the explosions actually can be significantly damaging. And to date, the only fatalities that have occurred were due to an explosion in a utility scale system in China to some firefighters. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the codes and standards that address energy storage systems here are captured in this graphic. And we put together this graphic to try and show people where the different codes affected a system. Now, I know that this is a commercial utility scale system, not a residential. But when you look at the overall installation, it's guided by the NEC, which is NFPA 70, NFPA 855 for those areas that enforce that, International Fire Code, which is the primary fire code, and it does reference. We tried to harmonize the IFC and 855. However, even though they're published in the same years, one is done before the other, so it's a little bit of a back and forth between them. The product standard 9540, and then the IEEE C2 is essentially the NEC for utility installations. Then when you actually look at the system itself, there's different standards, product standards, or codes that reference those. So this is just a good graphic to help you understand. On the residential side, we have 1973, 9540, and the 9540 standard. I think I have a slide. I'll get into that in a minute. So, okay, let's see here. Let's go on to the next one here. Okay, so let's dive real quickly into 855 and the International Fire Code. These are the key installation documents or codes that reference the installation of energy storage systems. 855 is really only enforced in about 5 states, but if you're in one of those states that adopt the international or the NFPA 1 fire code, the section on energy storage, I believe it's chapter 52 in the 2021 edition, just points directly to, it's a redaction from 855. The 2021 IFC, which is the most current published one, but not widely adopted yet in the US, very closely harmonizes with 855. And the 2024 edition, which will be released later this year, will have further improvements. NFPA 855 is getting ready to release its next edition, the 2023 edition, after the technical meeting in a couple of weeks, barring last minute floor votes. You could actually go online and see what the second revision looks like. It experienced a lot of reorganization and some refinements in some sections. Okay, so I bullet the key areas that it references. Okay, let's go ahead to the next section. So for the IFC, you could have a technical committee that really does great work, but if it's not adopted for 4, 5, 6 years, that's really one of the challenges. So as a national lab, one of the things that we do when we work with projects is we really try and encourage from the RFP stage of a larger project to an AHJ or installer to really build to the best practice. And so while California is officially on the 2019 the 2019 IFC, California adopts it into the California Fire Code. What they do midway through their 3-year cycle is they bring forth changes that they see are critical in the next edition. So California did that with the energy storage requirements. And so they brought forth the language in the 2021 IFC. But not all states adopt even statewide. You can see that with the white states don't adopt statewide, they adopt locally. So you could really have even more of a checkered quilt effect. And so for those of you that are national installers, you understand that pain. So that is one of the challenges out there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so 9540, and let me just see real quick here. You know what, I think what I would like to do, Brad, I want to hand this off to you now to have you talk a little bit about your experience in the process of approving systems with listing. And we can go back to the 9540 slide or use that one here, but I wanted to hand off to you.
Actually, yeah, just before we get into that, just on the last topic of which codes you're using, I just briefly want to touch on, because this is a very common question that comes up, is should I be using the residential code versus the fire code? The good news is, as we keep developing code cycles today, in the 2021 international code, they are very streamlined and there are very minimal differences between them. So the goal of the international code committees is, and I'm speaking to the residential section, the goal of the international code committees is to get those residential sections aligned as much as possible between the fire code and the residential code. And there's still a few minor differences, but like I said, today, the good news is that they are very much in alignment with each other. So, obviously, if you're seeing commercial systems, you're using the fire code. If you're seeing residential system in a commercial application, which we have seen, you're using the fire code. If you are seeing a residential application that exceeds the thresholds allowed by the residential section, then you're using the fire code. Thank you, Kristen. This was a code interpretation. Now, granted, this was back from 2020. So this was before the July 1st, 2021 supplement came out that aligned these residential sections of the CRC and the CFC. But the question was asked for residential installations, should AHJs be using the residential code 327 or the fire code of section 608? This was before chapter 12 incorporated all of the ESS. And this is something we struggled with, back before that mid-code cycle adoption. They were vastly different. If we chose to use the fire code for residential applications, the fire code is very restrictive would have made residential installations very difficult in most scenarios. Or on the flip side, the residential code had almost no requirements for ESS. So if you're still on the 2018 international code or earlier, this is a real issue for you. And we chose, as a jurisdiction, we saw what was coming down the pipeline, and we saw what had been approved in California by the Office of the State Fire Marshal. So we knew that this July 1st push was coming. So we actually started enforcing those requirements for residential systems early, prior to July 1st. And the State Fire Marshal's interpretation supported that, as you can see in the last paragraph of this. So, but you see the intent from the State Fire Marshal's interpretation for those residential energy storage systems that fit into the residential code. The desire is to use that code. But like I said, today, it's very much aligned with the fire code. So if you're on one of the current code cycles in California, or looking forward to the 2021 international code, either way, I'll touch on a few of the differences later, but for the most part, they are very streamlined.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, and then, so now we're moving on to product listing, right, Matt?
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else from the IC. So just summarizing it, there are requirements in the residential section. There are also requirements in the fire code. Typically, for a standard residential system, the requirements in the residential code in the 2021 have enough clarification of the requirements for a standard system. If you want to put it in a larger system, that's going to direct you back to the fire code for additional requirements. And as Brad said, they're more restrictive. It's going to treat you more like a commercial installation, but everybody that has a house in Brad's jurisdiction has a mansion, so they want large energy storage systems. Yeah, so let's see. I'm scanning the questions here, the chat. Thank you everybody for your engagement on there. I'm not seeing any questions, more kind of comments from folks, so that's great. Keep using that. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the 9540 product listing. And would you like to start off with your experience as an AHJ with that requirement for systems being listed? You want me to start?
Sure. So I think one of the most important things to know when it comes to, and I'm going to compare and contrast a little bit between 9540 and 9540A. And really one of the key points I want you, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, one of the main points is understand that 9540 is a listing and 9540A is a test report. It is not a listing. And that is a really important distinction. So,
and Brad, sorry for jumping in. Those of you out there could find data sheets for batteries, or when you get down to the certifications part, under certifications, they will list 9540A, or they'll even say past 9540A. And that's an incorrect interpretation of what that is. It's good that they're putting their products through 9540A, but it's really a test to generate data that can be used to help design the fire protection of the system or help inform that the systems can be placed closer together. But it is not, as Brad says, any type of certification or passing. So thank you for saying that, Brad.
Sure. And so the 9540 listing is for a unit level system. You're not going to get a 9540 listing for individual components. As you can see from Matt's slide, batteries have their own UL listing. The inverter will have a listing. The management system may have its own listing, but really that 9540 listing is for the entire system that's put together as a unit. The other key point with that is UL has gone through obviously several iterations of the 9540 listing. And I know one thing we've seen lately that has been a bit of a struggle for us as an AHJ. For example, recently we got a 9540A test report for a commercial system that had failed. Just flat out, they stopped the test because it failed. Yet this product had a 9540 listing. And I was thinking, well, how can that be? Because currently the 9540 listing for commercial systems requires the 9540A testing. And that's because the system got its 9540 listing under the first edition of UL's 9540 listing, and subsequently did the 9540A testing more recently. So I'm still, we still have questions out to UL and the manufacturer on how that affects their 9540 listing, but it's an interesting conundrum between the different editions.
Brad, let me touch on that if I could.
Yeah.
The genesis of the 9540A test method was developed to help help create data. Lithium ion batteries installed in residential and commercial was in its infancy. There was some questions on safety. You really want to develop codes and standards based on data, not just a random 3-foot number, which truly that's where that came from. So, okay, you create an initial number, you have a starting point, but you want to back it up with data so that my modifications are based on data. So that's what 9540A was really intended for. What we're seeing now is that 9540A is increasingly becoming a part of the product listing, depending on the locations of the batteries installed. So somebody could get their system listed to 9540 with the full knowledge that this system will be designed to be installed in remote locations where, per the fire codes, there is an allowance for not having any fire protection. However, many systems are being designed to be installed in multiple locations. And so that manufacturer is being guided to also do that fire test so that that data is available. And so that's a little bit of the evolution. In the second edition of 9540, the 2020 edition, it does require the fire testing for indoor installations, for residential installations. And so now where we're at is that there is a requirement in fire codes that the fire test report be made available to the AHJs. And Scott, I see your comment there. It's a really good comment here. There is a lot of room for education across the stakeholder group on how to interpret a 9540A report. The test reports, are done by a number of different labs at varying levels of quality, quite honestly. I've seen some reports that are missing a lot of information, others that are very complete with actionable information that makes sense when you look at the explosion control designs. So I think what would be really helpful in the standard is to standardize the test report as well. I know that there's an attempt to do that, at least in the requirements that's in there, but I think the effect when you look at some of the reports is that there's room for improvement in what the reports show. Let's see.
Yeah, definitely. Is there any? Should we go into the 9540A reports?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
Talk about Matt with 90. Okay. So another key point that I want you to take away from this webinar is you need to review these reports. As Matt said, there's a lot of variation in the reports. It's not a listing, so it's not something that you can just take and say, well, someone's submitting us this 9540A report to us, so it must be okay. In my jurisdiction, we have yet to review a 9540A report that we didn't have comments for. We have yet to approve one on the first go around. Even reports from UL, who's writing the standard, we always have comments because the reports do differ so much. And in this webinar, we're not going to teach you how to review these reports. That is an entire class of itself. But I just want to maybe touch on some highlights and again, make you please be aware that you have to review the reports. And if you don't want to learn how to do that or don't have the expertise, talk to maybe some of your fellow jurisdictions, neighboring jurisdictions who have reviewed them. Use the networking that you have available to talk to others. Or, I hate to say it, but if you're not going to use the report or review the report, I would err on the side of safety for the residential systems and say you can not approve them. The code is still going to allow the installers to install them with 3-foot spacing, right? For the main purpose of the 9540A reports for residential systems is so that the manufacturers can install them in different methods beyond what the base code allows. So
Brad,
the key point is that these 9540A reports, if you look at the fire and residential code, are subject to AHJ approval. So you really need to look at these reports and be comfortable with them before you approve them for installation in a manner other than what the base code is stipulating. Sorry, Matt, I know you wanted to say something.
No, that's fine. No, thank you for your comments. I think they're really important as an AHJ. I wanted to share an area where I've heard a lot of questions and concerns. Part of the 9540A test, and let me just really quickly kind of review for a lot of you. The 9540A test looks at the cell level, and that's used to identify, can it go into thermal runaway and produce flammable gases? And if it does, then you automatically go to the module level test. And again, during that cell level test, you're trying to understand what the gases are that come out, how fast they come out, what's the lower flammability limit. And that's all data that's really important later on in your design. So then the module level test, the idea there is to understand what it takes to generate propagation from a heated cell to unheated cells, and then what is the effect of a module level fire? Can it propagate to other modules? Now, on residential systems, that module level might be very similar to a unit level test, but that is the next level, is the unit level test with its enclosures. And one of the requirements of that test, or in the performance criteria, is that you don't have any fire outside of that unit. And so again, this is a residential side, and they wrap it with cheesecloth. So you could have a battery that does not have any fire coming out, okay? And that could, as Brad was just alluding to, that could guide the manufacturer to seek approval and get it to put their batteries very close together or stacked. You're not going to have that heat flux that will drive it in a thermal runaway. But here's the area where I think there's room for improvement. It's the gas data. You could still have a lot of gas evolved that didn't catch fire during the test. And in the 9540A report, at the very bottom there, thank you so much for putting that up. Can you scroll up just a little bit? A residential indoor. Okay, look at subclause D. Can you zoom in, please, Kristen? This is really a key one here that I think, ULs definitely look at. The STPs looking at improving it. Okay, subclause D. Explosion hazards are not observed, including deflagration, detonation, or accumulation to within the flammability limits in an amount that can cause deflagration of battery vent gases. And I'm sorry, it's E. Go to the next page at the very top. Do we have the next page on that one?
I think it's on the, these are screenshots. So
okay, that's fine.
I think it's the, we do have it. I think it's the next file.
That's non-residential. We need to go to the residential. And what it's going to say is that the flammable gases shall not be larger than 25% of the lower flammability limit of the smallest area the battery is installed. Okay, that's in the residential requirement. So what does that mean? What that means is that if a manufacturer is putting their battery inside a smaller space, then it could be that there's enough flammable gases developed during that test that you could have an explosion risk. So my personal feeling is that it would be very helpful if the test report actually stated, based on this test, this is the smallest cubic foot space or cubic meter space that this battery should be placed in. That would provide the manufacturer some actionable data to include in their installation manuals. Any comments on that, Brad? Or
that's a great point. And to date, I have not seen that provided in any of the 9540A reports, and that is always one of our comments. So obviously, as AHJ, you want to know how small a space can the installer safely put one of these systems. So the gas data is there in the report, and typically what ends up happening is either the manufacturer, I think usually it's the manufacturer, once we comment, will hire an engineer or a qualified person to take the data from that test report and figure out what the smallest volume of allowed is when you hit your 25% LFL. So that is definitely a critical piece of data for us to know for installing these. And a bit of the irony is, you know, this is only a part of the 9540A report. So if someone wanted to install a residential system in a small utility closet, and they are maybe only one unit, or they had 3 feet of separation between them, you wouldn't be required to know that data just per the base code for the 9540 listing. It only comes into play with this 9540A report. But that is a key piece of data, and really the reason we were showing you these screenshots was you get a copy of UL 9540A if you don't have one already for reviewing these. And in the back, I just wanted to highlight these tables that the tables do a nice job of summarizing what the requirements are for the different installations. And you have to pay attention to the application of where they're installing it. So for example, you know, if the 9540A report was tested for indoor and outdoor wall mounted, but the application that you receive is for a ground mounted, and they didn't test for that, well then they need to test for that. So making sure that the application that you're seeing for the installation matches what the test conditions were.
Brad, let me highlight what you just said in another way. You could have a battery that was evaluated as a ground mounted battery, and now it's being installed on a wall. A ground mounted battery it's acceptable to have flame coming outside of it, as you can see in subsection A there. If flaming is outside the unit observed, the separation distance shall be determined by the glazed flame extension. So that allows some flames to come out. But now if that battery is installed on a wall, you would not be allowed to have fire come out. So that's a great example that you just highlighted there. I'm monitoring the chat too, and I wanted to do a quick shout out to a comment from James Trudeau at UL. Thank you, James, for saying that. He highlights one of the challenges in performing a good test. It really depends on how many cells go into thermal runaway. And this goes back to the quality of the test that's done. I have seen tests where only one cell was driven into thermal runaway by the heated cell. And the way it was done, it was not representative of the worst location in the module. It's one of the reasons why the 4th edition made some changes, because the 3rd edition, it allowed some modifications to the module. So there is some magic in performing these tests, and I wish it wasn't that way, but ideally you want to have it be performance-based, where somebody can design a module that is safe or has very great propagation mitigation and receives acknowledgement from that. So we're always walking a tight line in creating standards. You don't want to be too prescriptive. Okay.
One other thing actually two other things to quickly mention with this. The previous graphic we showed you was a AHJ checklist that UL makes available. That's a great starting point for reviewing these reports. I'm sure Kristen can provide the link for you, but I think if you just Google, UL 9540A AHJ checklist, you can probably find it pretty easily online. So use this checklist. It's a great starting point. And then the other, I just wanted to mention very briefly.
Hey, Brad.
Yeah.
Bruce Johnson put a link to that in the chat.
Awesome.
Yep.
Perfect.
Thanks,
Thank
Bruce.
you, Bruce. One other thing I quickly wanted to mention was when we're reviewing, one thing that we've experienced in reviewing these reports This is relatively new testing, new standards. We're on the 4th edition. UL is already working on the 5th edition. And so as they're going through the testing, they're realizing things are changing and maybe some new things are necessary and some other requirements are not necessary. So we've seen some reports that are omitting data that UL stipulates as necessary for the report. I'll give an example of heat flux. It's not showing heat flux for a wall mount residential installation indoors. And UL has already made modifications to the way they're testing. However, that's going to be coming up in the 5th edition. But using what's currently published, you wouldn't know that they have changed their requirement to say, well, we're using a cheesecloth, so charring of the cheesecloth is good enough. We don't need to report the heat flux. They have published, I need to see what CRD stands for because I always forget.
Let me make a comment.
There's certification requirement decisions. So UL has these, and I think as an AHJ, if you ask them, they'll make them available to you. But they have a group of decisions that they've made in the process of doing this testing that has modified what the requirements are for the report. So just be aware that that those are out there.
On the topic of heat flux, and I'm going to lean on my UL folks in the room here. My understanding is that you're not going to have a heat flux reading if you don't have flame. And so if you only have gas production, the report will show no heat flux. Can someone correct me if I'm wrong there? Because I too am seeing a lot of that, which makes sense. Okay, thank you, James. So that's why, Brad, that you're seeing that. It's not that the report's inaccurate. It's just that the results of the test had no flame to measure. Now that brings up the question, what happens if those gases ignite? And that right there is a big topic of discussion among many fire protection engineers is why are we not igniting the gas plume to understand what's going on? Obviously, you ignite that gas plume, you've changed everything, all right? So really hard to design to protect against fire. But it is a question out there. So, okay, let's see, what else do we have here? All right, we have an electric vehicle question. Drew, thank you. Yeah, it is interesting, all right? We're gnashing our teeth and rolling our thumbs over a 20 kilowatt hour battery on a wall, but we have a 100 kilowatt hour battery parked next to it. It deserves consideration. I put it in the perspective box that we need to have a perspective about all of this. And there have been some electric vehicle fires. I will share with you that electric vehicle fires inside structures, both residential, parking garages, remains an area of significant concern worldwide. So it's not that there's no focus on it. It just because vehicles are not bound by, codes and standards. SAE is very different. We have limited flexibility on, making recommendations or enforcement. So, but we may see some restrictions on EV charging in parking garages. That is being discussed internationally. Okay.
I think we should move on. I see we're coming up on the hour. We got 10 minutes left. So we're going to move on from the 9540A reports. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on some of the most common questions that I hear and see. And I apologize if I make reference to a lot of California requirements, because that's what my experience is. But hopefully I'll try to keep it as generic across the board as possible to ICC. So first thing and again, I'm going to focus on residential. So first thing that we see when we're talking about the residential section of either the CRC or CFC, that was very confusing to me the first time I saw it. Let me pull it up. So in the very beginning, the applicability of the section for residential ESS. I apologize, I should have had this pulled up ahead of time. Under the scope, so it gives exceptions that say you don't have to follow that section of the code if you're less than 1 kilowatt hour, which we're never going to see a system that's less than 1 kilowatt hour, or if it's listed and labeled in accordance with UL 9540 and marked for use in residential dwelling units were installed in accordance with manufacturer's instructions. And when I first saw this, I'm like, well, what the heck does this mean? Of course, all of these ESS systems are going to be for residential use. But what that means is when a system is tested at the cell level, it will not go into thermal runaway. So to date, I am not aware of any lithium ion systems that have met this requirement. So if anyone is making the argument that they're for use in residential dwelling units and this doesn't apply, you need to explore that further. So that's what that means.
And Brad, to that point, that marking has been called the unicorn mark.
What I'll say is we get there probably with different technology, but
yeah, correct. Other technologies, if there was a residential flow battery, that could potentially have that. A sodium ion, other technologies. But I think UL was, maybe more hopeful in product rollout, and then that could be useful. But there is a proposal to actually remove that in the next edition, that labeling, because it did create a lot of confusion. I agree.
Okay. Yeah. Next, I'd like to just touch on allowable locations for residential ESS. And Kristen, if you could bring up that California Office of the State Fire Marshal interpretation for me. This was actually issued pretty recently, March 30th, 2022. And I was a bit surprised at the interpretation. But the question was, and we've gotten this question several times. So the code says you can have these maximum capacities for these different locations, 40 kilowatt hours in closets or basements, or 80 kilowatt hours in garages, 80 kilowatt hours on exterior walls, or 80 kilowatt hours outdoors on the ground. And the question was, well, if I have 40 kilowatts in a closet and 80 kilowatts in my garage, is that allowed as an aggregate quantity, or is it 80 in the garage and you're done, you're not allowed anywhere else? And so the response is, it is cumulative. So you can have 40 in a closet and another 80 in the garage. And so you could potentially have up to 280 kilowatt hours if you're utilizing all four of those separate locations. The one area that this doesn't really address that has been an issue for us is, well, what would you do? What would you consider if you're working with an ADU and you have 80 kilowatts in the garage of the main house and another 80 kilowatts in the garage of the accessory dwelling unit? So it doesn't address that, but I think based on this interpretation, my interpretation of the intent and the spirit of this is that I would personally allow those different systems, those different batteries in different structures, because I think the intent is to have those different fire separation areas. And obviously with an ADU, it's a different fire separation area. Now, would I allow 280 kilowatt hours for the main house and 280 kilowatt hours for the ADU? It's a good question. Personally, I'm probably not going to be comfortable with that, but it's.
Brad, let me touch on this one. I think you've clarified that the intent was not per fire area, but per residence or location. I think that's an accurate interpretation, because having a battery here and outside the building another battery does not represent combined risk. The risk is in an individual unit. And so, I don't even think that, Brad, if you had 280 on your house there in Santa Clara, and then you built an ADU, had another 2 ADU, it's about separation. These do not all fail at once. I think it's important for us to understand that in the spirit of perspective. Okay. We look at an individual unit and what its ability is when a failure occurs, and, and design based on that, a single failure. We're not looking at multiple point failures. So important point.
Next section, briefly want to touch on is spacing. I think we all probably know and we've touched on this already a bit. The base code spacing is 3 feet between residential units, unless the manufacturer submits that 9540A test report to you, and you as the AHJ approve that report for some other type of spacing. One quick point I want to make sure is clear on this is there's also a requirement for spacing from windows and doors of the unit. If you're putting it on an outside wall, that you need to be 3 feet away from any windows or doors that go into the habitable space. An important point is that 9540A report does not allow you to encroach upon that 3 feet for windows and doors. It only allows for different spacing in respect from one unit to the next. So you always have to maintain that 3 feet from windows or doors going into the habitable space. Now, if someone's putting a unit on an exterior wall next to a garage window, an attached garage, I'm going to allow that because that's not going into the habitable space. But that's one important point, that the 9540A report is only for spacing between units, not to windows or doors. The next section, vehicle impact protection. This one has been challenging for us. Fortunately, in the 2024 ICC code adoption, both residential and fire code have done a great job in offering a lot more guidance on the vehicle impact protection requirements. Initially, the fire code referred to 312, which is the general guidance for vehicle impact protection, which is very difficult to do in residential applications. Currently, the code references back to the mechanical section of the code, which was intended more for things like hot water heaters. So the current guidance in the 2024 code is really great. And fortunately, if you're in California, I've been looking at the final express terms that are going to be published July 1st, and California has pulled that 2024 code forward into the upcoming 2022 California Fire and Residential Code. So I would take a peek at what has been adopted for 2024, and that offers some great guidance to use for vehicle impact protection. And then finally, I wanted to touch on, because this question comes up all the time and has probably been one of the biggest thorns in our side is the issue of smoke and heat alarms when you have, and specifically when you are installing units in unconditioned spaces. So, and this is where we're going to get a little variance between fire code versus residential code, and also international code versus California code. So base requirement is if you are, what do I want to cite here? I guess I'm going to read the California code. And so the current code says if you're installing ESS in, let me get to the right section.
Kristen's got the bulletin up there too. I don't know if you see that.
Oh, thank you, Kristen. The current code requires you to, if you're installing them within a dwelling unit or basement or attached garage, you have to provide detection. So if they are in the dwelling area, you're probably going to use smoke alarms. If they are in a garage, please don't use smoke alarms because you're going to get a lot of nuisance alarms and the homeowner is probably just going to rip it out because of all the nuisance alarms. So really the way to go in an unconditioned garage or an unconditioned space in general is with a heat alarm or a heat detector. So a couple issues here. One is the UL standard for heat alarms, which I believe is UL 539, currently doesn't cover unconditioned spaces. So here in Santa Clara County, California, we get some warm weather at times, and temperatures can get up in the 100s. And if you look at most of the heat alarms that are sold at like Home Depot or the commonly accessible ones, those ambient temperature ratings are limited to 100 degrees. They generally activate at 135, but if you look at the listing, the ambient temperature is 100. So you're going to have to make a determination of whether you feel comfortable or not with that heat alarm that is not necessarily listed for unconditioned spaces, and particularly if you're in a geographic area that experiences high temperatures. The California State Fire Marshal realized this was an issue, and so they released this informational bulletin. It's not a code interpretation, it's just an informational bulletin, and they basically said they realize the issue with the 100 degrees and what's currently out there for heat alarms. So they don't offer a lot of guidance, to be honest with you. They tell you to try to do the best you can is how I read this. Obviously, if the garage, if the home and the garage are sprinklered, that is a great way to provide the residents with alerting them to an issue going on. So we have definitely allowed, if the garage is sprinklered, that we're not going to ask for any heat or smoke detection because the sprinklers are going to do a good job of doing that. The other thing that we have used is there are smoke detectors on the market that are listed for residential use, can be wired to 120 volt and have the capability to be either interconnected to the home smoke alarms or can be connected to an accessory device. And so what we've done in some systems is had that smoke detector installed with connected to a mini horn in the home. So remember, the intent is to alert the occupants that something's going on and they need to get out of the house. So the most important thing to me is that audibility in the home. So interconnection obviously is first preference. And there also, I have seen a intermediate temperature heat alarm that can connect wirelessly to other smoke alarms. So that's another option. But to me, my goal when I'm thinking about these different options is always, do I have audibility in those bedrooms that when a person is sleeping, they're going to know something's going on in the garage and they're going to be able to get out of the house. So I would ask, I could talk about this for another half hour, but I know we're short on time, so I'm not going to. But I would ask that you keep that in mind as your main focus of what is the intent of this section. And it's really to alert the residents. So if I just have a heat alarm in the garage that's not connected to anything, and I have a 10,000 square foot mansion and the bedroom's way on the other side of the house and I can't hear anything, well, that doesn't do me any good. If I'm in the garage and something happens to the system, obviously I'm going to know it. Really, the intent is to alert the occupants in the house that something's going on. So,
hey, Brad.
Yeah,
I'd just like to highlight an interesting discussion in the chat. So one, Bruce mentions that the standard is being updated, but we've also had somebody post that there is actually a product available that's listed for that temperature. And I just looked at it. It's available on Amazon. So the market seems to be responding, which is really good news. So if all the installers out there, take a look at that product that's listed there, and hopefully it will suit your needs to provide this level of alert.
The only other thing that I was going to do is show a couple sets of plans. I think we might not do that just in the interest of time and make sure we're answering people's questions. But one key point that I was going to make in regards to that is make sure that the relevant information that the inspectors need is shown on the plans. Oftentimes in a lot of departments, the fire department may be doing the plan review, but it's the building electrical inspector that is seeing these in the field. So make sure that you're working with the building department and getting that relevant the relevant information that pertains to fire safety related issues on the plans, because the building code, the building inspector may not be aware of all of those. So, and when you're reviewing these plans, there's really what I was going to highlight is it's very basic information that can be provided. I mean, for residential permits, you're not, for commercial permits, I think they're a lot more involved and there's a lot more information you need. But for residential applications, as long as they are identifying, they can clearly identify where it's being installed, indoors, outdoors, and if that's a garage or where the specific area is, they're touching on spacing, they're hitting all of those couple key points that are required in the residential section. There's really not a lot of detailed information that is required to get an approval for these systems in residential applications. So
let me summarize one thing. In looking at the poll, I'd like to ask the few folks that felt that it was not as useful, could you please share in whatever format you feel comfortable what you are hoping for? While it's great to hear that we're hitting the mark for folks, for me personally, I want to know where we're missing. What information could I provide that would have you feel like it was right? So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is There were some comments in the chat of the over restrictive nature, the costs, the burdens of this. And I just want to say that in the fire and life safety community, when codes are being created, they're either reactionary or trying to foresee potential safety issues. And, in the attempt to try and address the critical climate change nature, I'm really sensitive to our impact on that. And so I like to use the three bears analogy, that we really could have incredibly over restrictive codes, which some people might see this as, or we could have essentially no codes and allow people to put batteries anywhere, any kind of battery, and just, completely electrify everything. Chances are we will have failures and loss of property and life. So the goal is always to try and find the mama bear, set of standards. And we really try and walk that line to understand what that is. And so there's always modifications. The challenge is that codes are updated triannually, and it's just not fast enough for the numbers. So I guess I ask for a little bit of grace and to participate in the code process to help make it better. All right.
So there looks like a few questions in the Q&A, including a question about the wireless option. I think that was for the heat detector. I don't know, Brad, if you have the part number. Was that the one you looked at online on Matt?
Yeah, and we got some comments from Vincent that it is still listed at only 100 degrees. So okay. I'm hopeful that it'll be out there, but thank you for that, Vincent.
And then
I was trying not to recommend specific products,
yeah,
but
that's fine.
I did recently receive a listing of a heat alarm that was intermediate temperature and had wireless capabilities to interconnect to other smoke alarms.
Mm-hmm. I do see another question about UL 9540. It says, when is the UL 9540A report required? And I know you covered that, but let's make sure. That's a good question.
Sure. Okay, how long can older standards? Okay, so let me take a quick stab at that. All right, so there's two things at effect here. One is the addition that is referenced in the fire code. And when a fire code is updated, it can only list standards that are published. So the 2021 International Fire Code identifies the first edition of 9540 because that's what was published at the time that was created. However, the second edition of 9540 came out shortly after the 2020 edition was created. The next effect in getting it updated is the adoption cycle. And so for UL, the adoption period or grace period of that first edition, and correct me if I'm wrong, all the UL folks here, I believe it is this coming July of 2022 when a manufacturer has to use a second edition. July. Thank you, James. You're spot on. Well, that's 9540A. Second edition 9540. Is that? I think that's what he's saying is that everyone will need to follow the second edition of 9540, which would require 9540A for the residential installations as of this July. Intertech, July 15th for second edition. Okay, so this July. Thank you, everybody. That's very helpful.
I see a question, Matt. They're asking what you meant by the unicorn mark.
Okay. So the unicorn mark would be a mark on an energy storage system that has met the performance requirements of the cell level fire test. What that means is that it does not go into thermal runaway and produces no flammable gases. Okay. If it passes that, then the energy storage system based on that technology could have a mark that says suitable for use in residential dwellings. Now, like I said earlier, that is going to be removed because it's only added confusion. If somebody still had that technology, they could still do it. There's other paths to allow it to be installed in the living room or bedroom, if you wish, for a technology like that. But that marking, assuming how the balloting goes, will probably be removed because it's just added confusion. I hope that helps.
So, gentlemen, while you guys are reviewing the questions and maybe kind of coming up with kind of summarizing the questions that you're seeing and the key points, I'm going to take a minute just to make sure people see a couple of websites that are available, because that's certainly one of the questions people have. Where can I learn more? And so there's two websites that are part of this project in particular, this Department of Energy funded Empowered project to produce free, easy to access information about distributed energy resources such as energy storage systems. One is called the Clean Energy Clearinghouse. And we have resources such as short videos, if you're interested in kind of these buildings of the future, which are grid interactive, efficient homes. We've got downloadable checklists about codes related to these different technologies. We've got some EV charging information and certainly more to come. And what you'll find with kind of each of these things is a little bit more information about where you can learn more. So additional references that you can download. I'm going to just launch a quick poll to see, I'm curious to know who has heard of this resource before, and then also kind of in what way you prefer to have your training supplied. We've got a series of trainings on cleanenergytraining.org for AHJs, as well as some for firefighters. And these are interactive videos or other self-paced trainings that are about 15 to 30 minutes, so that hopefully people can kind of squeeze these in on their lunchtime. We've also developed training for the Solar app, which is that online permitting tool, and that is for both solar and storage systems. Primarily, I think those are being used by AHJs in California, but that's certainly becoming wider spread. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of those two free resources and can take advantage of that. So my polling question is just to understand kind of how much is being, are we hitting the mark with those things? We have a couple more years just on this project alone to develop what you are looking for in the formats that you are looking for. And as I'm going to let the gentleman wrap up, I will tell you, we did record this webinar. We will make it available on both of these sites. And we'll also try to take maybe some smaller snippets of the sections if you want to just revisit, the 10 minutes or so. And certainly one of the questions was about what Brad didn't get to, which was kind of showing what he looks for in plans and what are commonly missed. So we'll work with him to see if we can create something that you can learn more about that process as well.
Yeah, I've been going through these, and I'd like to thank everybody for your active engagement on it. This is what makes it worth your time, my time. I apologize if we didn't answer a question. I did see one I want to make a comment on. And it was, let me scroll back to it here. So Greg mentions, so an ESS could show the UL 9540A, but not be listed to 9540. Let me answer it this way. All ESS has to be listed to 9540. That's the listing for the entire ESS. Depending on the location, it may require the fire testing to 9540A. So just getting listing doesn't necessarily require the fire testing. However, the changes in the second edition of 9540 have pretty much required fire testing for all systems. And I think that future editions, it will become merged where fire testing is just part of it. Yes, it is expensive. But I think what we're starting to see is that cell manufacturers have the data on their cells. If I'm a manufacturer of an energy storage system and I'm buying cells from from Brad, and Brad also makes modules. That data should be available for the cell module level, but I might only need to do it at the unit level. So there will be some economies of scale in some of this testing, so that just modifications of the enclosure or size doesn't necessarily require all testing to be redone if it's the same components. So that's a prediction on my part there, on that question. I hope that helps you out there, Gregory. So Paul asked, what if a company has first edition of UL 9540 and they've done the UL 9540 to the 4th edition test? Good question, sir. I would say that as long as the first edition is acceptable in that jurisdiction, they've provided the latest fire test data to design the system for those safety sections. So, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think that would meet the requirements of an AHJ, showing the product listing and the fire testing, depending on the installation.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Matt.
So there's some folks out there that are hoping for commercial and utility scale. That's definitely a whole separate topic. It's one that I've done a number of webinars on, but I think, Kristen, we can maybe do something for that, focus more on that.
Yep, thank you for the suggestions. So I want to thank everyone while they're looking over the last answers. Again, thanks everyone for coming and staying till the end. We're glad to hear that this was a good starter for folks and hit the mark for many people. We'll continue to reach out to folks on this call and hopefully hear more about the specific comments you had. You gave me some general information now about the types of topics about which you'd like to see training, and that's what we'll continue to plan to work on. We are planning to develop a couple more inspection videos, field inspection videos about energy storage systems, as well as electric vehicle supply equipment. Those are in addition to the about 5 field inspection videos of residential solar PV systems and 1 commercial carport. So those are on our website, and if you haven't seen them already, it's a great introduction to kind of a process to doing field inspection. And we recently added a 12-part series about if you permit solar PV systems, kind of what main things to look for as you're reviewing the permit, and it gives you a chance to practice with a real set of plans so that you get a chance, practice at looking at them online and what you're looking for. So with that, Matt and Brad, how would you like to sum up?
Well, I'd like to say thank you for everyone that took this time out of your day, and also helping educate us and the others on the call. I did want to make one comment to Sean's Q&A comment about wanting more information on interconnection. Critical, excellent comment. And Kristen, I think we should address that in a future comment because it is important. But in closing, I just want to say that what you're witnessing is an evolving space. It is sausage making. It is ugly sometimes, and it's not always the best. So we count on broad stakeholder input. If people are left out of the discussion, that it's not the best product. So everyone's welcome to participate in the process. Sometimes you need to be appointed, and the general public can. They are users of the code. So no one's intentionally left out. So thank you.
Yeah, no. Also, just thank you everyone for your participation. I wasn't really sure what to expect with this and who the different stakeholders on this chat would be, but we got a great turnout, and Kristen will definitely take your suggestions and questions into consideration. So in the future, we can tailor these towards the information that you want to know. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks again to both of you, Matt and Brad, and please look for an email with a recording and some resources from us. So thanks, everyone. Have a good day.